Chapter 1. Sometimes the most profound moments in our lives arrive disguised as ordinary kindness. Sometimes a simple sandwich can change everything. And sometimes, the person sitting next to you on a park bench might just be exactly what your soul has been searching for. The autumn afternoon sun filtered through the golden maple leaves above Riverside Park, casting dancing shadows across the weathered wooden bench where Solange Rivers sat with careful precision. Her dark hands, elegant despite the rough edges that spoke of too many cold nights, unwrapped a peanut butter sandwich with the reverence others might reserve for fine dining. This wasn't just lunch, it was her only meal of the day, and quite possibly her last until tomorrow's soup kitchen opened. But Solange had learned something profound during her 8 months living in her rusted Honda Civic. Dignity wasn't something you lost with your address. It was something you chose to carry, even when the world tried to strip it away. So she sat straight-backed on that bench, her worn but clean sweater smoothed over faded jeans, watching the city bustling past with the same quiet observation that had once made her the most beloved third-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary. Her fingers paused as she began to divide the sandwich in half, a habit born from a lifetime of sharing, even when sharing meant she'd go hungry. The bread was store-brand white, the peanut butter generic, but it represented the last $4.37 to her name until she could find work. Any work. Pride had cost her everything once, she wouldn't let it cost her survival. That's when she noticed him. The man who collapsed onto the far end of her bench didn't sit, he fell like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His expensive charcoal suit was wrinkled, his silver-touched hair disheveled, and his face bore the particular exhaustion that came from fighting battles no one else could see. Theodore Blackwood, though Solange didn't know his name yet, looked like he carried the weight of the world on his broad shoulders. For a moment, neither acknowledged the other. The bench was public space, after all, and in a city of millions, strangers shared seats without conversation every day. But there was something about the defeated slump of his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly as he pressed his palms against his temples, that called to the teacher in Solange, the nurturer who had never quite learned to stop caring about wounded souls. Rough day? Her voice was soft, melodious despite months of uncertainty, carrying the warmth that had once helped anxious children feel safe in her classroom. Theo looked up, startled. His blue eyes, pale as winter sky, met her deep brown ones, and for a heartbeat, something shifted in the space between them. He saw kindness where he'd expected indifference, genuine concern where he'd braced for judgment. She saw pain where others might have seen only privilege, humanity where the world saw only an expensive suit. "You could say that," he replied, his voice rough with fatigue. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude on your lunch." Solange glanced down at her half sandwich, then back at this stranger who looked like he hadn't eaten in days despite his obvious wealth. The silk tie, the handmade Italian shoes, the Rolex catching afternoon light, everything about him screamed money. But his eyes screamed hunger of a different kind entirely. Without hesitation, she extended half of her sandwich toward him. "You look like you need this more than I do." The moment hung suspended between them like a soap bubble, fragile and iridescent. Theo stared at the offering, rough bread with peanut butter spreading beyond the edges, held by hands that bore the calluses of struggle, and something cracked open in his chest. When had anyone last offered him something without wanting something in return? When had anyone looked at him and seen need instead of opportunity? "I couldn't," he said automatically, the response of someone trained to refuse help. "That's your lunch." "And I'm sharing it," Solange replied simply. "My mama always said a sandwich tastes better when it's shared with someone who needs it. Besides," she added with a smile that transformed her entire face, "you really do look like you could use some fuel." Their fingers brushed as he accepted the sandwich, and both felt it, that electric jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with souls recognizing their match. The touch lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, long enough for heat to travel up Solange's arm and settle in her chest, long enough for Theo to wonder when such a simple contact had felt so profound. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than gratitude for food. He bit into the sandwich, and the simple flavors exploded on his tongue like the finest cuisine. Not because the peanut butter was exceptional, but because it was offered with genuine care. "I'm Theodore." "Theo." "Solange," she replied, settling back against the bench as if they were old friends sharing a picnic instead of strangers sharing her last meal. "Nice to meet you, Theo." As they ate in comfortable silence, the world seemed to slow around them. Office workers hurried past toward coffee shops and restaurants, joggers pounded along the path, mothers pushed strollers laden with the comfortable chaos of family life. But on their bench, time moved differently, measured not in minutes but in stolen glances and the gradual relaxation of two guarded hearts. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. This is really good, Theo said, though they both knew he wasn't talking about the sandwich anymore. He was talking about this moment, this unexpected oasis of human connection in his desert of corporate isolation. Solange laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a summer evening. It's just peanut butter and bread. Nothing fancy. Sometimes the simple things are the most profound, he replied, watching how her eyes crinkled when she smiled. I've eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants, but I can't remember the last time food tasted this good. Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. The expensive suit, the weary sophistication, the way he held himself despite his exhaustion, this wasn't a man accustomed to park bench lunches. But there was also something broken about him, something that resonated with her own hidden fractures. What do you do? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would only emphasize the impossibility of whatever was sparking between them. I run a company, Theo said carefully, the same way he'd learned to deflect personal questions in business settings. Technology sector. What about you? Solange hesitated. The truth that she was homeless, unemployed, living in her car seemed too heavy for this delicate moment. But lies had never come easily to her, and something about Theo's own careful honesty deserved better. I'm between opportunities right now, she said finally. I was a teacher. 3rd grade. But life had other plans. The pain that flickered across her features told him there was much more to that story, just as she sensed there was more to his corporate speak about running a company. But neither pushed. Some truths had to be earned, not extracted. 3rd grade, Theo mused. That must have been rewarding. Working with children, shaping young minds. It was everything to me, Solange said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of loss. There's nothing quite like seeing a child's face light up when they finally understand a concept they've been struggling with. When they realize they're capable of more than they imagined. Theo watched her transform as she spoke about teaching, saw how her entire posture straightened and her eyes brightened with purpose. This was a woman who had loved her calling, who had poured herself into nurturing others. The contrast with his own sterile boardroom existence couldn't have been starker. What made you leave teaching? He asked gently. Solange's smile faded, replaced by something fragile and carefully controlled. Medical bills. My mother had cancer, and even with insurance. She shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the brutal mathematics of American healthcare. Sometimes loving someone costs everything you have. And then some. The simple honesty of her statement hit Theo like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had sacrificed her career, her stability, possibly everything, for love. When had he last made a decision based on love rather than profit margins? When had he last put another person's needs before his own advancement? I'm sorry, he said, and meant it more than any condolence he'd ever offered. That must have been devastating. It was, Solange acknowledged. But I'd do it again. She was worth everything I had to give. She looked at him with those penetrating brown eyes that seemed to see straight through his expensive armor. What about you? Family? Theo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My wife died 6 months ago. Cancer, actually. The parallel hung between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss and medical battles that couldn't be won with money alone. But where Solange spoke of her sacrifice with quiet pride, Theo's tone carried something else: guilt, regret, the bitter taste of love that had never been real. I'm so sorry, Solange said, her hand moving instinctively toward his before she caught herself. The aborted gesture of comfort felt more intimate than if she'd actually touched him. That must be incredibly difficult. It's complicated, Theo admitted, then wondered why he was being honest with this stranger when he hadn't been honest with his own therapist. We married for practical reasons. Business merger. I told myself it was enough, that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. The admission hung in the autumn air between them, more naked than if he'd removed his suit jacket. Solange felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of kindred damage. They were both walking wounded, both carrying the weight of choices made from necessity rather than desire. Love isn't a luxury, she said softly. It's what makes everything else worthwhile. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, both felt the dangerous pull of possibility. Here was someone who understood sacrifice, who had chosen love over security. Here was someone who knew the cost of authenticity in a world that rewarded performance over truth. The spell was broken by Theo's phone buzzing insistently in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen inside, his assistant, probably wondering where he was for the 3 o'clock board meeting. The meeting where they'd discuss quarterly projections and market positioning and all the soulless machinery that kept Blackwood Industries profitable. I should go, he said reluctantly, standing but making no move to leave. Work calls. Of course, Solange replied, though something in her voice suggested she understood that work meant more than just obligations, it meant returning to separate worlds that might never intersect again. Theo pulled out his wallet, and Solange's spine stiffened. If he tried to pay her for the sandwich, to turn her kindness into charity, something beautiful would die between them before it had a chance to live. But instead of money, he pulled out a business card, hesitating before extending it toward her. I eat lunch here most days. Same time. In case you're ever in the neighborhood again. Solange took the card, her fingers brushing his once more. Theodore J. Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer, Blackwood Industries. The company name was familiar, one of the city's major employers, the tech giant whose headquarters dominated the downtown skyline. She was holding a business card that probably cost more to print than she spent on food in a week. You're that Theodore Blackwood, she said, not accusingly but with dawning understanding. The billionaire. Theo winced at the label, though it was accurate. I prefer grateful sandwich recipient, he said with a self-deprecating smile that made him look years younger. The other title comes with complications. I imagine it does, Solange replied thoughtfully. She looked down at the elegant cardstock in her hands, then back at his face, vulnerable despite his obvious power, lonely despite his obvious success. Same time tomorrow? The hope in his voice was carefully controlled, but she heard it anyway. Would you like that? I would, she said simply, and meant it more than any words she'd spoken in months. As Theo walked away, his stride gradually resuming the confident pace of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms, Solange remained on the bench, holding his business card and trying to process what had just happened. She'd shared her last sandwich with a stranger and somehow found herself looking forward to tomorrow in a way she hadn't since her world fell apart. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened and reality reasserted itself, doubt crept in. What could a homeless former teacher possibly have in common with one of the city's wealthiest men? What had felt like genuine connection might have been nothing more than his polite gratitude for her kindness. By tomorrow, he'd probably remember who he was and who she wasn't, and the magic of this moment would evaporate like morning mist. Still, as she carefully tucked his card into her wallet next to her expired teaching license and her mother's final hospital bill, Solange allowed herself to hope. Sometimes miracles wore expensive suits. Sometimes they arrived disguised as shared sandwiches on park benches. And sometimes, just sometimes, they looked at you like you were exactly what they'd been searching for their entire life. The autumn wind picked up, sending golden leaves dancing around the now empty bench, but the warmth in Solange's chest had nothing to do with the weather. For the first time in 8 months, she wasn't thinking about where she'd sleep tonight or how she'd find her next meal. She was thinking about tomorrow, and the man who'd looked at her offering of half a sandwich like she'd just handed him the world. Neither Solange nor Theo slept well that night, though for entirely different reasons. She lay in the back seat of her Honda, wrapped in the thin blanket that had become her security, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she'd imagined the electricity that had passed between them. He paced the marble floors of his penthouse, 40 stories above the city, trying to reconcile the profound peace he'd felt on that park bench with the hollow luxury surrounding him. Both counted the hours until lunchtime, neither willing to admit even to themselves that a simple act of kindness had cracked open something inside them that had been sealed shut for far too long. Tomorrow would tell them whether magic could survive in the harsh light of day, whether connection could bridge the chasm between their worlds, and whether a sandwich shared in kindness could become the first chapter of a love story that would transform them both. In a city of 8 million people, two lonely souls had found each other on a park bench. The question now was whether they'd have the courage to see where that discovery might lead. Chapter 2. The next morning arrived with the crisp promise of October, painting the city in shades of amber and rust. Solange woke in her car to the sound of early commuters rushing past, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls of the parking garage where she'd found shelter for the night. The security guard here was kind. He pretended not to notice her Honda among the legitimate overnight parkers, a small mercy that meant she could sleep without fear of being moved along by police. She stretched carefully in the cramped space, her body protesting another night on makeshift bedding. Once, she'd owned a queen-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, a matching dresser, and a walk-in closet filled with professional wardrobe. Now she owned what fit in a duffel bag and a few cardboard boxes in the trunk. But as she reached for her toiletry kit and the change of clothes she'd laid out the night before, Solange felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Theodore Blackwood had said he ate lunch at that bench most days. He'd given her his business card and asked if she'd be there tomorrow. Today. In 6 hours, she would discover whether yesterday's connection had been real or simply the fantasy of a lonely woman reading too much into a stranger's politeness. She made her way to the YMCA 3 blocks away, where a day pass bought her access to shower facilities and a few precious moments of dignity. The hot water felt like luxury itself, washing away not just the grime of another night in her car, but some of the shame that had become her constant companion. As she shampooed her dark curls with the travel-sized bottle that had to last another week, Solange allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to have a real conversation with someone who saw her as more than a problem to be solved or avoided. In the mirror afterward, she studied her reflection with critical eyes. At 34, she still carried herself with the poise that had made her one of Riverside Elementary's most respected teachers. Her dark skin had the kind of natural glow that no amount of expensive skincare could replicate, and her eyes, large and expressive behind long lashes, still held the warmth that had made children feel safe in her classroom. But there were shadows under those eyes now, and a thinness to her frame that spoke of too many meals skipped. She dressed carefully in her least-worn jeans and a burgundy sweater that brought out the richness of her complexion. It was clean, pressed with the iron at the shelter's volunteer center, and free of the telltale signs of someone living rough. If she was going to see Theodore again, he'd said to call him Theo, she wanted to look like the woman she still was inside, not the circumstances that had befallen her. Have you ever met someone who changed your perspective in just one conversation? Share your story in the comments below. I love hearing how unexpected connections have touched your lives. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse that could house 20 families, Theodore Blackwood was experiencing his own morning ritual of preparation, though his looked vastly different from Solange's. He stood before a bathroom mirror that cost more than most people's cars, electric razor in hand, trying to understand why he'd woken thinking about peanut butter sandwiches and eyes the color of rich coffee. His reflection showed a man who'd aged well into his 45 years, silver threading through dark hair in a way that suggested distinction rather than decline, broad shoulders that still filled his custom suits with authority, and blue eyes that had learned to reveal nothing in boardroom negotiations. But this morning, those eyes looked different somehow. Uncertain. Almost hopeful. The previous day's board meeting had been brutal, even by Blackwood Industries standards. Quarterly profits were up 15%, but the board wanted 20%. Market expansion was ahead of schedule, but competitors were gaining ground in emerging technologies. For 3 hours, Theodore had fielded questions, challenges, and barely veiled threats about his leadership with the same cold precision that had built his empire. Then he'd walked to that park bench feeling like he was drowning in his own success, and a homeless woman had offered him half her sandwich like it was the most natural thing in the world. Theo paused in his shaving, remembering the way Solange's face had transformed when she spoke about teaching. The passion, the genuine love for nurturing young minds. When had he last felt that kind of connection to his work? When had building something meaningful mattered more than beating the competition? His phone buzzed with the day's first crisis. A client threatening to pull a multi-million-dollar contract unless Theodore personally intervened in some petty dispute. The kind of emergency that would normally have him canceling personal plans and rushing to the office to perform damage control. Instead, he found himself typing a response that would have shocked his assistant. Handle it. I'm unavailable from 12 to 2 p.m. today. Unavailable. Theodore J. Blackwood, the man who'd built an empire by being available 24 hours a day, was making himself unavailable to sit on a park bench with a woman whose last name he didn't even know. The morning crawled by for both of them, each minute stretching like hours. Solange spent the time at the public library, reading job listings on the computer and submitting applications for positions she was overqualified for: retail clerk, restaurant server, office temp. Her education and experience meant nothing when she had no permanent address, no references from her previous life, and gaps in her employment history that she couldn't honestly explain without revealing her circumstances. But every few minutes, her fingers would drift to the business card in her wallet, tracing the embossed letters of Theo's name. Theodore J. Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer. The gulf between them seemed vast as an ocean, but she remembered the loneliness in his eyes, the way he'd accepted her simple offering like it was precious beyond measure. Theo, meanwhile, found himself distracted in every meeting, checking his watch with increasing frequency as lunchtime approached. His assistant, Margaret, had worked for him for 8 years and prided herself on anticipating his needs, but she was baffled by his sudden interest in keeping his lunch hour free. "Sir, the Patterson Group is demanding a conference call at 1:30, she said, reviewing his schedule. "Shall I move your appointment?" "No," Theodore replied firmly. "Tell Patterson we'll handle it tomorrow. Nothing interrupts lunch today." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she'd learned not to question the eccentricities of brilliant men. If Mr. Blackwood wanted to guard his lunch hour like state secrets, that was his prerogative. At 11:30, both Solange and Theo began gravitating toward Riverside Park, though neither would admit to leaving early. Solange told herself she wanted to enjoy the fresh air after hours in the stuffy library. Theo told himself he needed the walk for exercise. Both were lying to themselves with the tender dishonesty of people afraid to hope too much. Solange arrived first, settling onto the same bench with a sense of déjà vu so strong it made her breathless. The autumn light was perfect, painting everything in golden honey tones, and the park hummed with the gentle activity of office workers on lunch breaks and mothers with strollers enjoying the crisp weather. She had no sandwich today, no money for even that simple luxury, but she'd brought something else, a worn paperback copy of Charlotte's Web that she'd found in the library's free exchange box. She'd read this book to her third graders every October, watching their faces as Charlotte's friendship with Wilbur unfolded. The story of unlikely love transcending circumstances had always resonated with her, but today it felt like prophecy. Some pig, indeed. When Theo appeared at the edge of the park, still 50 yards away, Solange felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine withdrawal. He moved differently than other businessmen, less hurried, more purposeful, and even from a distance, she could see him scanning the benches until his gaze found her. The smile that spread across his face was barely contained, transforming his serious features into something boyish and genuine. He wasn't carrying a lunch either, she noticed, but he had something tucked under his arm, a white paper bag that made her stomach clench with dread. Please, she thought desperately, don't let this be charity. Don't let him turn yesterday's magic into today's pity. Good afternoon, Solange, Theo said as he approached, his voice carrying warmth that made her name sound like music. Hello, Theo, she replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the way her pulse was racing. Beautiful day, isn't it? It is now, he said, then looked slightly surprised at his own boldness. But something about this woman, this place, seemed to strip away the careful corporate diplomacy he'd perfected over decades. Around Solange, he found himself saying what he actually meant instead of what was strategically advantageous. As he settled onto the bench beside her, leaving a careful distance that somehow felt more intimate than if he'd sat closer, Theo noticed the book in her hands. Charlotte's Web, he observed. I haven't read that since I was 12. It's a perfect book, Solange said, her fingers tracing the worn cover. Every time I read it, I discover something new. The friendship between Charlotte and Wilbur, the way she sees his worth when no one else does. It reminds us that being different doesn't mean being less valuable. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. A spider and a pig, a homeless woman and a billionaire, unlikely connections that defied conventional wisdom about who belonged with whom. You said you taught third grade, Theo said. Is that your favorite book to read with students? Solange's face lit up with the same passion he'd glimpsed yesterday. One of them. There's something magical about watching children discover that books can be friends, that stories can teach us about ourselves. I always told my students that every character in literature has something to teach us about being human. What does Charlotte teach us? Theo asked, genuinely curious. That love is an action, not just a feeling, Solange replied without hesitation. Charlotte doesn't just tell Wilbur she cares about him, she weaves words into her web to save his life. She uses her talents to serve love, even when it costs her everything. Theo absorbed this, thinking about his own life spent accumulating rather than serving, building walls rather than webs of connection. And what does Wilbur teach us? That being worthy of love isn't about being perfect or impressive, Solange said softly. Wilbur is just a pig who wants to live, to matter to someone. But Charlotte sees something special in him that he can't see in himself. Sometimes we need someone else's eyes to show us our own worth. The conversation hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Were they still talking about a children's book, or had they wandered into more dangerous territory, the kind where hearts could be broken and dreams could be shattered by cold reality? Theo cleared his throat and gestured to the white bag he'd set beside him on the bench. I brought lunch, he said. For both of us, if you're interested. I thought it might be nice to return the favor. Solange's stomach clenched again, but this time with hunger rather than dread. She'd eaten nothing since yesterday's half sandwich, and the aroma wafting from the bag, fresh bread, real meat, something that smelled like heaven, made her mouth water involuntarily. What did you bring? She asked carefully, testing the waters of his intentions. Sandwiches from Moretti's Deli, Theo replied. Italian sub with everything, and... He paused, looking almost shy, peanut butter and jelly. I thought you might appreciate the parallel. Despite her wariness, Solange laughed, a genuine sound of delight that made Theo feel like he'd just won every business award in existence. You brought me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? I asked for the good peanut butter, he said with mock seriousness. The expensive stuff. Figured I should upgrade from yesterday's generic brand. You're spoiling me, Solange said, but she was smiling as she said it. This didn't feel like charity, it felt like friendship, like two people sharing a meal because they enjoyed each other's company. As they unwrapped their sandwiches, Theo found himself studying Solange's profile, the elegant curve of her neck, the way afternoon light caught the gold undertones in her dark skin, the careful grace with which she moved despite her obvious hunger. Everything about her suggested refinement, education, a woman accustomed to better circumstances than those she currently faced. Can I ask you something? He said, then plunged ahead before she could refuse. How does someone go from teaching to? He gestured vaguely, not wanting to voice her homelessness directly. Solange was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth this near stranger could handle. But something about Theo's genuine interest, the way he'd asked without judgment or pity, made her want to trust him with her story. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, she began, her voice steady but soft. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments cost more than I made in a year. I sold my house, cashed out my retirement, took loans against everything I owned. For 18 months, I fought alongside her, believing that love and determination could beat anything. She paused to take a small bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. She died anyway. And I was left with medical debt that buried me so deep I couldn't see daylight. Lost the house to foreclosure, then the apartment when I couldn't make rent. The school district couldn't keep a teacher with no permanent address, liability issues, they said. Theo listened with the complete attention he usually reserved for merger negotiations, but this time his focus came from compassion rather than strategy. He watched her hands as she spoke, graceful, steady hands that had once guided children's fingers as they learned to write, that had held her dying mother's hand through countless treatments. I don't regret it, Solange continued, meeting his eyes directly. She was everything to me after my father died. If I could go back, knowing how it would end, I'd make the same choices. Love isn't a luxury you can afford or not afford, it's who you are. The simple strength in her words hit Theo like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had sacrificed everything for love and emerged with her heart intact, her capacity for caring undiminished by loss. When had he last made a decision based on love rather than profit margin? When had he last put another person's needs before his own advancement? He began, then stopped, realizing that words like admirable or inspiring would cheapen the magnitude of what she'd shared. That's the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing I've ever heard. Solange studied his face, searching for traces of pity or the kind of morbid fascination that some people brought to others' tragedies. Instead, she saw something that looked like awe, tinged with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "What about you?" she asked gently. "Yesterday you mentioned your wife. Was it difficult, losing someone you loved?" Theo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he looked away toward the pond where ducks glided serenely across the surface. "That's the problem," he said finally. "I didn't love her. And she didn't love me." The admission hung between them, stark and honest. Solange waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "Vivian came from old money, the kind of family that could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower," Theo continued. "Marrying her gave me social credibility I couldn't buy. Marrying me gave her access to new money that could fund her charity boards and social climbing. It was a business arrangement that worked for both of us." "But not for your hearts," Solange observed quietly. "I told myself I didn't need love." Theo's laugh was bitter. "I had my empire, right? Built it from nothing. Trailer park to penthouse." He looked down at his hands. "Love seemed like something I couldn't afford. Turns out I couldn't afford not to have it." He turned back to meet her eyes, and Solange saw pain there that money couldn't heal. "When Vivian got sick, I gave her the best medical care available. The finest doctors, experimental treatments, private hospitals. Everything except the one thing that might have mattered: genuine emotion. She died knowing she was married to a man who cared more about his stock portfolio than her suffering." "You cared," Solange said with quiet certainty. "Maybe not the way a husband should love a wife, but you cared enough to fight for her life. That matters." "Does it?" Theo asked, his voice raw with doubt. "I could afford treatments that might have saved her, but I couldn't afford the time to hold her hand during chemo. I could buy her anything she wanted, but I couldn't give her the one thing money can't purchase: authentic love." They sat in silence for a moment, two people who had both lost someone to cancer, both carried guilt about the choices they'd made in love's name. But where Solange's guilt was about not being able to do more, Theo's was about not being able to feel more. "Love isn't about perfection," Solange said finally. "It's about showing up, even when you don't know how. Even when you're afraid. You showed up for her in the way you knew how." "Did I?" Theo asked. "Or did I just write checks and hope money could substitute for actual presence?" "You're here now," Solange pointed out. "Yesterday you could have walked past this bench, ignored a homeless woman, gone to your important meeting. Instead, you accepted half a sandwich from a stranger and came back today. That tells me something about who you really are underneath all that armor." Theo looked at her with something approaching wonder. When had anyone last seen past his net worth to the man beneath? When had anyone offered him absolution instead of judgment, understanding instead of condemnation? "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "See people's hearts instead of their circumstances. Find something worth caring about in a broken man sitting on a park bench." Solange smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over water. "The same way you saw someone worth sharing lunch with in a homeless woman holding a book. We recognize what we're looking for, even when we don't know we're searching." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Because what she was really saying was that they really saw each other, in a way that transcended their vastly different circumstances. And that kind of seeing was the first step towards something that could heal them both or destroy them completely. As if sensing the weight of the moment, Theo changed the subject to safer ground. Tell me about your students, he said. What was your favorite part about teaching? And for the next hour, as autumn light shifted through the trees and office workers gradually returned to their buildings, Solange painted pictures with words of classrooms filled with laughter and learning. She told him about Marcus, who struggled with reading until she discovered he was brilliant with numbers, then helped him see that math was just another language waiting to be decoded. About Sophia, who had been labeled a problem child until Solange realized she was just bored, and challenged her with advanced reading that transformed defiance into enthusiasm. Every child has a gift, Solange said, her eyes bright with memories. The magic happens when you help them discover what makes them special, what makes them shine. Theo found himself hanging on every word, watching the way her hands moved as she spoke, how her voice took on different tones when she mimicked her students' voices. This woman who had lost everything still spoke about her former life with joy rather than bitterness, love rather than resentment. You'll teach again, he said with quiet conviction. Someone with your passion, your natural ability to inspire, the world needs teachers like you. Maybe, Solange said, though doubt flickered across her features. It's hard to convince administrators to hire someone with no fixed address. Background checks, references, the assumption that homeless means dangerous. She shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the prejudices that had closed doors in her face. That's their loss, Theo said fiercely, surprising them both with his vehemence. Any school would be lucky to have you. The conviction in his voice made something warm unfurl in Solange's chest. When had anyone last championed her dreams, believed in her potential? When had anyone looked past her circumstances to see her capabilities? What about you? She asked, deflecting from emotions that felt too big, too dangerous. Do you enjoy running your company? Theo was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer honestly. I'm good at it, he said finally. I'm good at seeing opportunities others miss, at making decisions quickly, at building something from nothing. But enjoy? He shook his head. I can't remember the last time I felt passionate about a deal closing or a product launching. It's become mechanical. That must be lonely, Solange observed. Spending your days doing something that doesn't feed your soul. I didn't think I had a soul to feed, Theo admitted. I thought I traded it for market share and profit margins somewhere along the way. You have a soul, Solange said softly. A beautiful one. I can see it in the way you listen, really listen, when someone speaks. In the way you ask questions that show you care about the answers. In the fact that you came back today. Their eyes met and held, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with recognition. Here was someone who saw past the surface, who looked for beauty in broken places, who offered hope instead of judgment. The spell was broken by the distant sound of church bells chiming 2:00. Both started, realizing how completely they'd lost track of time, how absorbed they'd become in each other's stories. I should get back, Theo said reluctantly, though every instinct screamed against leaving this haven of genuine connection for the sterile competition of his office. Of course, Solange replied, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. Important meetings and all that. But neither moved. They sat there as the bells faded, unwilling to break the spell that had woven itself around them on this ordinary park bench transformed into something magical. Same time tomorrow? Theo asked, his voice carefully casual but his eyes holding an intensity that made Solange's breath catch. I'd like that, she said simply. This time, when Theo stood to leave, he didn't offer money or business propositions. Instead, he touched her shoulder lightly, a brief contact that sent electricity racing through both of them, and said, "Thank you. For lunch, for conversation, for this." "Thank you," Solange replied, "for seeing me." As he walked away, Theo felt the same reluctance that had plagued him yesterday, the sense that he was leaving something precious behind. But today was different. Today, they'd moved beyond polite strangers sharing food to two people sharing pieces of their souls. Today, he was certain that what he'd felt hadn't been one-sided. Solange remained on the bench long after his figure disappeared among the office buildings, touching the spot on her shoulder where his hand had rested. The simple contact had felt more intimate than kisses she'd shared with previous boyfriends, more meaningful than grand romantic gestures from men who'd wanted to impress rather than connect. But as the afternoon wore on and reality reasserted itself, familiar doubts crept in. What was she doing, developing feelings for a man whose world was so far from hers that they might as well live on different planets? What could she possibly offer someone who could buy anything he wanted? How long before he grew tired of her stories and realized that kindness didn't bridge the gap between penthouse and parking garage? Still, as she walked back toward her car as dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Solange found herself planning what she might share with Theo tomorrow. Not her circumstances. Those were too raw, too likely to inspire pity, but more of herself. Her dreams for the classroom she'd build someday, her thoughts on books and life and the small moments that made existence beautiful. Because for 2 hours on a park bench, she'd felt like herself again. Not homeless Solange or desperate Solange or pitiable Solange, but simply Solange, a woman with thoughts worth sharing and stories worth telling, a woman worthy of someone's complete attention and genuine interest. That night, as she curled up in the back seat of her Honda with Charlotte's Web pressed against her chest, Solange allowed herself to dream. Not of rescue or charity or someone solving her problems, but of connection. Of continuing to discover the thoughtful, lonely man hiding beneath Theodore Blackwood's expensive armor. Of being discovered in return not as a project to be fixed, but as a person to be treasured. And across the city, in a penthouse that suddenly felt more like a mausoleum than a home, Theo stood at floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering lights of the city he'd conquered. Somewhere down there, in circumstances he couldn't bear to fully contemplate, was a woman who'd made him remember what it felt like to be human. For the first time in months, he found himself thinking about tomorrow not as another day to be endured or opportunities to be seized, but as another chance to sit beside Solange Rivers and learn what it meant to live with an open heart. Both fell asleep that night with the same thought echoing in their minds: what if this impossible thing growing between them was exactly what they'd both been missing their entire lives? What if love, real love, was worth any risk, any complication, any consequence? What if a homeless woman and a billionaire could find in each other the very thing money couldn't buy and poverty couldn't steal? The healing power of being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved for exactly who they were beneath all the circumstances that defined them to the rest of the world? The answer to those questions would unfold one park bench conversation at a time, one shared laugh at a time, one moment of authentic connection at a time. Because sometimes the most profound love stories begin not with grand gestures or perfect timing, but with the simple courage to keep showing up, to keep hoping, to keep believing that somewhere in this vast and often lonely world, there's someone who will see your heart and recognize it as the treasure it's always been. Chapter 3. The third day arrived with the promise of rain, heavy gray clouds gathering like secrets in the October sky. Solange woke to the sound of droplets pattering against her car windows, the kind of gentle morning shower that would either pass quickly or settle in for the day. She checked her phone, 7:42 a.m. Still hours before she could reasonably make her way to the park, but her body was already humming with anticipation. 3 days. 3 conversations that had felt more substantial than months of small talk with other people. 3 moments of connection that had begun to feel less like coincidence and more like destiny. But destiny, Solange reminded herself as she gathered her toiletry bag and a clean shirt, was a luxury she couldn't afford. Whatever was growing between her and Theo existed in a bubble that would eventually burst against the sharp edges of reality. Men like Theodore Blackwood didn't build lasting relationships with women like her. Women with no addresses, no prospects, no ability to move through his world without embarrassing him. Still, as she prepared for another day, Solange found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She'd found a $20 bill in the pocket of a jacket she'd forgotten she owned, enough for coffee shop privileges and a real breakfast. More importantly, it was enough to feel human for a few hours instead of like a problem looking for somewhere to hide. Theo was experiencing his own morning ritual of anticipation, though his took place in a marble bathroom that cost more than most people's homes. For the third consecutive day, he found himself checking the weather with an intensity usually reserved for stock prices. Rain meant Solange might not come to the park. Rain meant their bench would be empty, their conversation postponed, their fragile connection tested by forces beyond their control. The irony wasn't lost on him that Theodore Blackwood, who controlled a business empire worth billions, was rendered powerless by the possibility of precipitation. His morning meeting with the board was scheduled for 10 o'clock, a discussion about the hostile takeover bid from Hartwell Corporation that threatened everything he'd built. Under normal circumstances, this would have consumed all his attention, demanded every strategic resource he possessed. Instead, he found himself dividing his focus between merger defense and the question of whether a homeless woman would risk getting soaked for the chance to share another lunch. The board meeting was as brutal as expected. 5 hours of lawyers and accountants and strategic advisors parsing every clause of Hartwell's offer, every weakness in Blackwood Industries' defense. The vultures circled with the patient hunger of predators who sensed wounded prey. "Theodore, we need to discuss succession planning," said Victoria Sterling, his business partner and the woman his board had been not so subtly suggesting would make an appropriate second wife. "If Hartwell succeeds in this takeover, your personal holdings won't be relevant," Theo cut her off. "Because they won't succeed." "Your confidence is admirable," said Richard Hayes, the board member who'd been questioning Theo's leadership for months. "But perhaps misplaced. You've been distracted lately. Less focused on the details that matter." Theo's jaw tightened. The details that matter. As if human connection, genuine emotion, the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who saw him as more than a profit margin, were distractions from what really mattered. "The company is performing above projections in every metric that counts," Theo replied coldly. "Unless you're suggesting that my personal time somehow impacts our market position?" "I'm suggesting," Richard said with barely concealed hostility, "that leaders who lose sight of priorities tend to lose everything else as well." The threat was clear, and it would have been devastating if Theo hadn't already begun questioning what everything else actually meant. Was it worth keeping an empire if it required him to remain the cold, calculating machine he'd become? Was it worth defending a fortune if it meant giving up the first genuine happiness he'd felt in years? By the time the meeting ended at 11:30, rain was falling in earnest, the kind of steady autumn shower that soaked through even expensive umbrellas. Theo stood at his office windows watching water stream down the glass and felt something remarkably like panic. What if Solange didn't come? What if their third day became the day their fragile connection was washed away by weather and practical concerns? He grabbed his coat and umbrella, ignoring Margaret's protests about his packed afternoon schedule, and headed for the park with single-minded determination. Meanwhile, Solange sat in a coffee shop 6 blocks from Riverside Park, nursing a single cup of coffee and watching rain create rivers down the windows. The logical thing would be to stay dry, wait for better weather, except that some conversations were more important than others and this one could wait. But logic had very little to do with the pull she felt toward that park bench, toward the possibility of seeing Theo's face light up when he spotted her, toward another hour of feeling like her thoughts and opinions mattered to someone. She checked her phone, 11:45. If she left now, she'd arrive right on time but completely soaked. If she waited for the rain to ease, she might miss him entirely. The choice shouldn't have been difficult. Any reasonable person would choose comfort over the slim possibility of a conversation with a near stranger. But as Solange stared out at the rain, she realized she'd stopped being reasonable the moment she'd offered half her sandwich to a broken man on a park bench. Reasonable women didn't develop feelings for billionaires. Reasonable women didn't believe that love could transcend circumstances. Reasonable women protected themselves instead of opening their hearts to beautiful impossibilities. She'd been reasonable her entire life until the last 8 months. Maybe it was time to be brave instead. Solange pulled up the hood of her thin jacket, gathered her courage like armor, and stepped out into the rain. The walk to the park was miserable in every practical sense, cold water seeping through her inadequate shoes, rain finding every gap in her clothing, her hair escaping its ponytail to curl damply around her face. But with each step toward their bench, Solange felt something lifting in her chest. This was choice, active and intentional. This was her heart overruling her head, hope overruling fear. When she rounded the corner that brought the park into view, she stopped dead. Theo was there. He stood beside their bench with an umbrella that was clearly expensive and completely inadequate for the current downpour, his usually perfect hair darkened with moisture, his suit jacket spotted with rain. He was scanning the park paths with the intensity of someone searching for something precious that had gone missing. When his eyes found her, bedraggled and breathless and utterly soaked, his face transformed. Relief and joy and something deeper chased each other across his features, and he started moving toward her with long strides that ate up the distance between them. "You came," he said when he reached her, having to raise his voice slightly over the sound of rain pattering against leaves and pavement. "So did you," Solange replied, surprised by how breathless she sounded. Water dripped from her eyelashes, and she could feel her careful morning preparation dissolving under the assault of weather, but Theo was looking at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "I was terrified you'd have better sense than to get soaked for lunch," Theo admitted, holding his umbrella over both of them though it provided minimal protection. "I was terrified you'd decide I wasn't worth getting wet for," Solange replied, then blushed at her own honesty. They stood there under his inadequate umbrella, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with rain and honest anxiety, close enough that their arms brushed when they moved. The park was nearly empty. Anyone with sense had sought shelter indoors, but neither suggested finding somewhere dry. "This is completely impractical," Theo said, but he was smiling as he said it. "Completely," Solange agreed. "We should probably go inside somewhere." "Probably," Theo nodded, but neither moved. Instead, they stood in the rain looking at each other, both acutely aware that this moment felt significant in ways that had nothing to do with weather. This was choice made manifest, two people deciding that being together mattered more than being comfortable, that connection was worth the risk of getting soaked. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks south," Theo said finally. "We could." His words were cut off by a sudden gust of wind that turned his umbrella inside out and sent rain driving horizontally across the park. Both laughed at the absurdity of it, and in that moment of shared amusement, something shifted between them. "This way," Solange said, grabbing his hand without thinking and pulling him toward a small stone pavilion that offered partial shelter from the storm. The moment their fingers interlaced, both felt it, that electric jolt of connection that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with two hearts recognizing their match. But there was no time to analyze it, no opportunity to second guess, because they were running through the rain together, laughing like children despite being thoroughly soaked. The pavilion was designed for summer concerts and outdoor weddings, with stone columns supporting a decorative roof that offered protection from direct rainfall but little defense against wind-driven moisture. Still, it was shelter of a sort, and more importantly, it was intimate, a small space that required them to stand close together, breathing the same rain-sweetened air. "Well," Theo said, attempting to restore his umbrella to proper shape, "this is not how I planned lunch." "How did you plan it?" Solange asked, wringing water from her hair and immediately regretting the question. She probably looked like a drowned cat, while he managed to look distinguished even soaked to the skin. "Civilized conversation," Theo replied, giving up on the umbrella and setting it aside. "Dry seating. Food that wasn't rain-flavored." He paused, studying her face in the gray light filtering through the storm. "This is better." "Better?" Solange laughed, gesturing to their soggy state. "How is this possibly better?" "Because," Theo said, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully, "this is the first spontaneous thing I've done in 20 years. This is the first time I've chosen something I wanted over something I should do. This is the first time I've stood in the rain with someone and felt like I was exactly where I belonged." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. They weren't talking about weather anymore, weren't discussing lunch plans or practical concerns. They were talking about the dangerous territory their hearts had wandered into, the place where homeless women and billionaires stopped being categories and became simply two people drawn to each other with increasing intensity. "Theo," Solange said softly, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. What could she say? That she felt it too? That every conversation left her wanting more, needing more, hoping for impossible things? That she was falling for him despite every logical reason why she shouldn't? Instead of words, she reached up and gently brushed a droplet of water from his cheek, her fingers lingering against his skin longer than necessary. The touch was tender, intimate, charged with all the things they couldn't say. Theo caught her hand before she could pull it away, holding it against his face like it was precious beyond measure. His eyes searched hers, looking for permission, for reciprocation, for confirmation that this madness was mutual. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Every meeting, every decision, every moment of my day, you're there. Your laugh, your stories, the way you see beauty in ordinary things. I'd built an empire, but I'd never felt as wealthy as I do sitting on that bench with you. Solange's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice, at the vulnerability he was offering her like a gift. I know I shouldn't feel this way, she whispered. I know this is impossible, impractical, insane. Do you feel it? Theo interrupted, his free hand moving to cup her face. This thing between us, do you feel it too? Instead of answering with words, Solange leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as rain continued to fall around their small shelter. They were standing so close now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could count the silver threads in his dark hair, could see the way his pupils dilated as he looked at her mouth. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility and desire and the dangerous sweetness of mutual recognition. Around them, rain drummed against stone and earth, creating a cocoon of sound that made the rest of the world feel very far away. We shouldn't, Solange breathed, even as her body swayed closer to his. Probably not, Theo agreed, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. But I don't care about should anymore. I care about this. About you. About the way you make me remember what it feels like to be alive. And then, with rain pattering around them and wind whipping through the stone pavilion, Theodore Blackwood, billionaire, business mogul, man who calculated every risk before taking action, threw caution to the wind and kissed the homeless woman who had become his obsession. The kiss was everything their careful conversations had been building toward. Tender but desperate, sweet but urgent, full of weeks' worth of suppressed longing finally given permission to breathe. Solange's arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer as his hands tangled in her damp hair. They kissed like people starved for connection, like souls recognizing their other half, like hearts that had been holding their breath finally allowed to exhale. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, rain still falling around them like nature's blessing on their moment of surrender, neither tried to step away. Instead, they stood forehead to forehead, sharing breath and wonder and the terrifying recognition that everything had just changed. This complicates things, Solange whispered, though she made no move to create distance between them. Everything worth having complicates things, Theo replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. The question is whether it's worth the complications. As if in response to his words, the rain began to ease, shifting from downpour to gentle shower to the kind of mist that makes autumn afternoons feel like poetry. Around them, the park began to emerge from its storm-induced hiding, and both knew their moment of perfect isolation was ending. But something fundamental had shifted in that stone pavilion. They had crossed a line from friendship to something deeper, acknowledged the pull between them that had been growing stronger with each shared lunch. There was no going back now, no pretending this was just kindness between strangers. I should walk you somewhere dry, Theo said reluctantly, though his arms remained around her waist. I should let you, Solange replied, though she showed no inclination to move away from his warmth. Instead, they stood there as the rain gentled around them, holding each other like they were afraid to let go, both acutely aware that stepping out of this pavilion meant returning to a world where their connection would be tested by every possible obstacle. But for now, in this moment suspended between storm and sunshine, homeless woman and billionaire were simply two people who had found something precious in each other's arms. Two people who had been brave enough to reach for impossible love and discovered it reaching back for them with equal intensity. The rain would stop. The world would intrude. Reality would reassert itself with all its complications and barriers and harsh judgments. But this moment, this perfect, imperfect, rain-soaked moment when two hearts finally admitted what they'd been hiding, would remain untouchable, a treasure neither circumstance nor society could steal away. They had kissed in the rain like characters in a romance novel, and somehow that made everything else feel possible too. Chapter 4. The morning after the rain brought crystal and autumn sunshine that made everything sparkle like the world had been washed clean and hung out to dry. Solange woke in her car with lips that still tingled from Theo's kiss, her heart hammering with a mixture of euphoria and terror that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarating and dangerous in equal measure. She touched her mouth gently, remembering the desperate sweetness of that moment in the stone pavilion, the way he'd held her like she was precious beyond measure. But in the harsh light of morning, doubt crept in like fog rolling off cold water. What had she done? What had she allowed to happen? Theodore Blackwood had kissed her. Not polite, friendly Theodore who brought lunch to share, but Theo, the man whose eyes went dark with want when he looked at her, whose hands trembled when they brushed hers, whose voice went rough when he said her name like a prayer. And she had kissed him back with everything she had, pouring months of loneliness and longing into that single moment of connection. Now what? The question haunted her as she went through her morning routine, made more complex by the fact that she no longer knew what she was preparing for. Yesterday, she'd been getting ready to have lunch with a friend, someone whose company she treasured but whose world remained safely separate from hers. Today, she was preparing to see the man who'd held her heart in his hands while rain fell around them like blessing. Everything had changed, and nothing had changed. She was still homeless. He was still a billionaire. The gulf between their circumstances hadn't magically closed because they'd shared a perfect kiss in an imperfect world. But as Solange caught sight of herself in the YMCA mirror, she saw something different in her reflection. A brightness to her eyes, a flush to her cheeks, a way of holding herself that spoke of a woman who remembered what it felt like to be desired, treasured, seen as beautiful by someone whose opinion mattered. For the first time in months, she looked alive. Theo was experiencing his own morning reckoning in a penthouse that felt even more isolated than usual. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city wake up below and trying to reconcile the man who'd kissed Solange Rivers in a rain-soaked pavilion with the one who had to face his board in 2 hours. Because that's what was waiting for him today, another brutal session of defending his leadership, justifying his choices, proving his worth to men who measured everything in quarterly profits and stock prices. The same board that would view his growing feelings for a homeless woman as evidence of compromised judgment, deteriorating focus, potentially disastrous personal liability. Richard Hayes had made it clear yesterday that Theo's distractions were being noted, catalogued, prepared for use against him if necessary. How long before someone connected his protected lunch hours to his mysterious afternoon disappearances? How long before private investigators captured photos of him with Solange that could be used to paint him as unstable, unreliable, unfit for leadership? But even as these practical concerns circled his mind like vultures, Theo found himself touching his lips and remembering the way Solange had melted against him, the soft sound she'd made when their mouths met, the perfect rightness of holding her in his arms while the world dissolved into rain and wanton recognition. He'd kissed women before, perfunctory pecks with Vivian, calculated encounters with socially appropriate partners chosen for strategic value rather than attraction. But he'd never kissed anyone the way he'd kissed Solange yesterday, like she was air and he was drowning, like she was home and he'd been lost his entire life. The memory should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with a heart that was finally, fully awake. The board meeting was as punishing as expected. Theo tried to focus on Victoria's presentation, but his mind kept drifting to brown eyes and rain-dampened curls. Theodore? Victoria's sharp voice cut through his distraction. Your thoughts on the Hartwell projections? 6 months ago, he might have been tempted by Victoria's not-so-subtle overtures, her careful positioning of herself as the logical choice for both business partnership and personal relationship. Now he felt nothing but polite appreciation for her competence. The projections look fine, he said, checking his watch. 40 minutes until lunch. 40 minutes until Solange. Theodore, are you listening? Victoria's voice cut through his reverie with surgical precision. This hostile takeover threatens everything you've built. We need complete focus, unified strategy, absolute commitment to defending our position. Of course, Theo replied smoothly, though part of him wondered if defending his empire was worth the cost anymore. What was the point of keeping a throne if he had to remain isolated on it? What was the value of power if it couldn't be shared with someone who understood the man beneath the title? Good, Victoria said, though her eyes remained sharp with speculation. Because there are rumors that you've been distracted lately. Personal entanglements that might compromise your judgment. The threat was delicate but unmistakable. Victoria knew something, or suspected something, or was fishing for information she could use. In the corporate world Theo had mastered, personal vulnerabilities were weapons waiting to be deployed. My personal life is exactly that, Theo replied with ice-cold authority. Personal. Anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to take their concerns to the board officially rather than trading in gossip and speculation. Of course, Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm simply looking out for your best interests. And the companies. The meeting continued for another hour, but Theo's attention was fractured between merger defense and the growing certainty that his time was running out. Soon, he would have to choose between the empire he'd built and the woman who'd become his salvation. Between the safe, sterile world of corporate power and the dangerous, beautiful possibility of authentic love. The choice should have been simple. Logic dictated protecting his life's work, maintaining his position, choosing security over sentiment. But logic hadn't been kissing him in the rain yesterday. Logic hadn't looked at him like he was worthy of love regardless of his net worth. Logic hadn't shared half a sandwich with a stranger because kindness mattered more than hunger. By the time Theo escaped to the park, he was vibrating with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Would Solange be there? Would she have second thoughts about what had happened between them? Would the magic of yesterday survive the harsh light of today's complications? His questions were answered the moment he rounded the corner and saw her sitting on their bench, reading her worn copy of Charlotte's Web and looking like every dream he'd never allowed himself to have. She was wearing a soft green sweater that brought out the gold in her dark skin, and her hair caught the afternoon sunlight like it was woven with threads of copper. When she looked up and saw him approaching, her face lit up with a smile so radiant that Theo felt his chest constrict with something that might have been love, might have been terror, might have been the recognition that he was already too far gone to save himself. "Hi," she said softly when he reached the bench, and somehow that simple greeting contained volumes of uncertainty and hope and remembered pleasure. "Hi yourself," Theo replied, settling beside her with careful attention to the space between them. Close enough to feel her warmth, far enough away to maintain the pretense that yesterday had been an aberration rather than an awakening. But pretense was impossible when her eyes were soft with memory, when the air between them hummed with awareness, when every breath reminded him of rain and stone pavilions and the way she tasted like hope itself. "How was your morning?" Solange asked, and Theo heard the real question underneath: "Are we okay? Do you regret what happened? Are you going to pretend yesterday never existed?" "Challenging," Theo replied honestly. "Yours?" "Confusing," Solange admitted with a rueful laugh. "I keep expecting to wake up and discover that yesterday was just a very vivid dream." "If it was a dream," Theo said quietly, "I don't want to wake up." The words hung between them, honest and dangerous. They weren't talking about weather or books or safe topics anymore. They were talking about the thing that had bloomed between them in the rain, the connection that felt too big and too precious to fit into their carefully separate worlds. "Theo," Solange began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to voice her concerns. "Say it," he encouraged gently. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're afraid of, say it." "I'm terrified," she admitted in a rush. "Yesterday was beautiful and perfect and completely impossible. You kissed me like I was precious, like I mattered, like I was worthy of someone like you. But in the morning light..." She gestured helplessly at herself, at her circumstances, at the obvious gulf between them. "In the morning light, you're still the most extraordinary woman I've ever met," Theo said firmly. "You're still the person who offered half her sandwich to a stranger. You're still the teacher who sees potential in every child, the daughter who sacrificed everything for love, the woman brave enough to risk getting soaked just to keep a lunch date." "I'm also homeless," Solange said bluntly. "I sleep in my car, Theo. I wash my hair in public restrooms and live on peanut butter sandwiches and whatever kindness strangers offer. I can't even put together a professional outfit for a job interview, let alone navigate your world of charity galas and board meetings. My world," Theo said with sudden vehemence, "is full of people who have everything money can buy and nothing that actually matters. My world values stock portfolios over character, profit margins over compassion, social status over authentic connection. You think you're not worthy of my world? My world isn't worthy of you." The passion in his voice made Solange's breath catch. This wasn't polite reassurance or charitable condescension, this was a man defending something he valued, fighting for someone he cared about. "But it's your world," she said softly. "Your empire, your life's work, everything you've built. I can't ask you to choose between that and this." She gestured to the space between them, to the impossible thing growing stronger with every shared moment. "You're not asking," Theo pointed out, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging in his chest. "I'm offering." The question is whether you want what I'm offering. What are you offering? Solange asked, though her heart was already racing with the possibilities and impossibilities contained in that question. Theo was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the pond where ducks glided serenely across water that reflected the autumn sky like a mirror. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making the most important decision of his life. Everything, he said simply. All of me, not just the successful parts, not just the socially acceptable parts, but the broken pieces and the lonely nights and the man who's been sleepwalking through his own life until you woke him up. I'm offering you my heart, Solange. Completely and without reservation. The declaration hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Solange felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming beauty of being offered something so precious by someone who could have chosen anyone. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. You don't understand what being with me would cost you. You don't get it, Theo said, turning to face her. Losing you would destroy me. I've spent 20 years building an empire that feels like a prison. I've accumulated wealth that can't buy the one thing I've discovered I need most: genuine connection with someone who sees me, really sees me, not my bank account or my social status or my usefulness to their agenda. He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. You see me, Solange. When you look at me, you see Theodore, not Theodore Blackwood, the CEO. You see the man who gets tired, who doubts himself, who's been lonely for so long he'd forgotten what connection felt like. That's worth more than every dollar in my accounts. But you're bored, your company will survive whether I run it or not, Theo interrupted. But I won't survive losing you. Not now that I know what it feels like to be fully alive. Solange searched his face for signs of romantic delusion, for the kind of temporary madness that made rich men think they could play at loving poor women until reality reasserted itself. Instead, she saw steady determination, clear-eyed recognition of consequences, and something that looked remarkably like the same desperate love that was growing in her own chest. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared that you'll realize I'm not enough. That I'm just some project you wanted to fix, and when the novelty wears off. I'm scared too, Theo confessed. I'm scared of not being enough for you, of disappointing you, of failing to protect what we have from people who won't understand it. I'm scared of losing everything I've worked for and discovering it wasn't worth having anyway. They sat there holding hands on a park bench, two people acknowledging their fears while choosing to reach for love anyway. Around them, the world continued its normal rhythms: joggers passing, office workers hurrying back from lunch, children playing in distant playground areas, but on their bench, time moved differently. So what do we do? Solange asked quietly. We choose each other, Theo said with quiet conviction. We choose this thing between us over the things that want to tear us apart. We choose love over logic, connection over convenience, authentic feeling over appropriate behavior. It won't be easy, Solange warned. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Theo replied. But easy isn't what I want anymore. I want real. I want you. Before Solange could respond, both their phones buzzed simultaneously with emergency alerts, a flash flood warning for the downtown area where they sat. The autumn storm was returning with vengeance, and everyone in the vicinity was advised to seek immediate shelter. As if summoned by the alert, the sky opened up with sudden, violent intensity. Rain didn't fall so much as assault, turning the peaceful park into a waterlogged battlefield in moments. Couples and families scattered for cover, umbrellas proving useless against the horizontal assault of wind-driven precipitation. This way, Theo shouted over the thunder, pulling Solange toward the nearby community center that anchored the eastern edge of the park. They ran hand in hand through the downpour, both laughing despite being instantly soaked, their careful conversation forgotten in the immediate need for shelter. The community center doors were propped open, and dozens of parkgoers had already taken refuge inside. Theo and Solange joined the crowd of rain refugees, dripping and breathless and oddly exhilarated by their sprint through the storm. Well, Solange said, wringing water from her hair, this is becoming a theme with us. Rain-soaked romantic moments? Theo asked, brushing water from his eyes. I can think of worse patterns to establish. They found themselves in the community center's main hall, a multipurpose space that doubled as an emergency shelter during severe weather. Volunteers were distributing towels and hot coffee to the displaced park visitors, and the whole scene had the feeling of an unexpected community gathering rather than a crisis. "Solange?" A familiar voice cut through the general chatter, and both she and Theo turned to see Pastor Peter Hayes approaching with a broad smile and 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I thought that was you. Are you all right, child?" "Pastor Peter," Solange replied with genuine warmth, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Yes, we're fine. Just caught in the storm like everyone else." Peter's eyes moved between Solange and Theo with the keen perception of someone who'd spent decades reading people and situations. Theo found himself being evaluated by a man whose opinion clearly mattered to Solange, whose judgment could influence her feelings about their relationship. "Pastor Peter Hayes," the older man said, extending his hand to Theo with cautious friendliness. "And you are?" "Theodore Blackwood," Theo replied, accepting the handshake and wondering how much Solange had shared about their growing connection. Recognition flickered in Peter's eyes. Everyone in the city knew the Blackwood name, even pastors who ministered to populations that existed far from corporate boardrooms. But instead of the calculating interest Theo usually encountered when people realized who he was, Peter's expression remained warmly neutral. "Mr. Blackwood," Peter nodded. "Any friend of Solange's is welcome here. She's been a blessing to our community, helping with our literacy program, working with the children. Natural teacher, this one." Theo felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the pride in Peter's voice, at the clear affection and respect the pastor held for Solange. Here was confirmation of what he'd already known, that her circumstances didn't define her worth, that she contributed value wherever she went, that she was treasured by people who saw her heart. "She mentioned the literacy program," Theo said. "That's wonderful work." "Essential work," Peter corrected gently. "Too many children in this neighborhood don't have access to the kind of educational support that builds strong readers. Solange has been a godsend, patient, creative, completely devoted to helping these kids succeed." Solange blushed at the praise, but Theo saw how she stood a little straighter, how being recognized for her contributions restored some essential part of her identity that homelessness had threatened to erode. "I'd love to hear more about the program," Theo said, and meant it. Not because he was looking for charity opportunities to impress Solange, but because anything that mattered to her automatically mattered to him. As rain continued to pummel the building, the three of them settled into an unexpected conversation about education and community development. "Tell me about the children you work with," Theo said, genuinely curious. Solange's face lit up. "There's this boy, Jamie, who couldn't read a single word when he started. Last week, he finished his first chapter book." She paused, smiling at the memory. "He looked at me and said, 'Miss Solange, I think I'm actually smart.' That's the real work," Pastor Peter added. "Not just teaching reading, but teaching these kids that they matter. That someone believes in them." Theo watched Solange as she spoke, seeing how her entire posture changed when she talked about the children. This was her calling, her purpose, the thing that made her eyes light up with authentic joy. Theo listened to Solange describe her work with struggling readers, watched her face light up as she talked about breakthrough moments when children suddenly understood that books were friends rather than enemies. He watched Pastor Peter describe the community center's mission, its struggles with funding and resources, its dreams of expanding programs that served families throughout the neighborhood. And slowly, an idea began forming in Theo's mind, not a grand gesture designed to impress, but a genuine alignment of his resources with his values, his growing love for Solange with his desire to support work that truly mattered. "Pastor Peter," Theo said during a lull in the conversation, "what would it take to expand your literacy program? If funding weren't an issue, what could you accomplish?" Peter's eyes sharpened with interest and caution. He'd learned to be wary of wealthy benefactors who made promises in moments of inspiration only to disappear when sustained commitment was required. "Well," Peter said carefully, "we'd need space for more reading groups, books appropriate for different age levels, trained volunteers to work one-on-one with children who need intensive support. A coordinator position to manage the program full-time would be ideal, but that would require significant ongoing funding." He trailed off, clearly reluctant to put specific numbers to dreams that might remain forever out of reach. What if I told you that Blackwood Industries has been looking for meaningful community partnerships? Theo asked. What if I said we could fund a full expansion of your literacy program, including that coordinator position? Solange's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been concern. Was this about her? Was he offering charity to gain her favor, to ease his conscience about their vast difference in circumstances? But as Theo continued speaking, outlining his vision for corporate responsibility that went beyond tax-deductible donations to create genuine community partnerships, Solange heard something else in his voice. This wasn't performative generosity or guilty conscience charity. This was a man whose values were shifting, whose priorities were realigning, whose definition of success was expanding beyond profit margins to include human impact. I'd need someone to oversee the partnership from our end, Theo said, looking directly at Solange. Someone who understands education, who has experience working with children, who knows this community and its needs. Someone with the vision to build something truly sustainable. The job offer hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. This was Theo offering her more than employment. He was offering her a way back to her calling, a chance to combine her expertise with resources that could transform children's lives, an opportunity to step out of survival mode and into purposeful work that fed her soul. But it was also dangerous territory. Accepting a job from the man she was falling in love with blurred lines, created dependencies, opened her to accusations of using personal relationships for professional gain. Theo, she said softly, you don't have to. I don't have to, he interrupted. I want to. Not because of this, he gestured between them, but because it's right. Because I've spent 20 years building wealth without building meaning, and you've shown me what it looks like to live with purpose. Pastor Peter looked between them with growing understanding, his pastoral instincts recognizing the complex emotions swirling beneath this conversation about literacy programs and community partnerships. This is about more than funding, isn't it? Peter asked gently. Solange and Theo exchanged a look that contained volumes of unspoken communication. How much should they reveal? How much of their growing connection could they acknowledge to someone whose opinion mattered deeply to Solange? Pastor Peter, Solange said finally, Theo and I have become close. These past few weeks, our friendship has deepened into something more complex. More honest, Theo added quietly. More real than anything either of us has experienced in a long time. Peter nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. And you're concerned about mixing personal feelings with professional opportunities? Among other things, Solange admitted. The differences in our circumstances, the complexities of caring for someone whose world is so different from mine. Child, Peter said with the gentle authority of someone who'd counseled countless couples through impossible situations, love doesn't ask permission from circumstances. It doesn't check bank account balances or social status before it takes root in hearts that are ready for it. He looked at Theo with measuring eyes. The question isn't whether your worlds are different, but whether your hearts are aligned. Whether your intentions are honorable, your commitment genuine, your love strong enough to weather the storms that difference will bring. It is, Theo said without hesitation, his hand finding Solange's. All of that and more. And you, Solange? Peter asked. Are you prepared to love this man not despite his wealth but alongside it? To help him use his resources in ways that honor both your values and your relationship? Solange looked down at their joined hands, then up at Theo's face. Open, vulnerable, waiting for her answer to the most important question anyone had ever asked her. Yes, she said simply. I love him. I love who he is, who he's becoming, who we might become together. The circumstances are complicated, but the feeling is simple. Thunder rolled overhead as she spoke, and lightning illuminated the community center windows, but inside their small circle of conversation, everything felt warm and safe and right. Then you have my blessing, Peter said with a smile. And my prayers for wisdom as you navigate the path ahead. As the storm began to ease outside, Solange felt something settle in her chest, not just love for Theo, but acceptance of that love, permission to stop fighting the impossibility of their connection and start building something beautiful from it instead. The vulnerable connection peak had been reached in the most unlikely of places. Not in rain-soaked pavilions or on quiet park benches, but in a community center filled with strangers, witnessed by a pastor who'd become their unexpected counselor, blessed by a man whose opinion mattered more to Solange than any social register or corporate board. They had crossed another bridge together, moved from attraction to acknowledged love, from secret feelings to public declaration. The path ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and opposition and moments of doubt. But they would walk it hand in hand, hearts aligned, committed to building something worthy of the love they'd been brave enough to claim in the middle of a thunderstorm. When the rain finally stopped and the emergency alerts were lifted, they emerged from the community center into a world washed clean and sparkling. Everything looked different in the aftermath of the storm, brighter, more vivid, full of possibility. "So," Theo said as they walked slowly back toward the park, neither eager to end this day that had changed everything, "what happens now?" "Now," Solange replied, squeezing his hand, "we figure out how to build a life together. How to love each other well. How to use what we have, separately and together, to make the world a little better than we found it." "Starting with the literacy program?" Theo asked. "Starting with us," Solange corrected. "Everything else grows from there." As they reached their bench, still dripping from the storm but somehow looking like the most beautiful piece of furniture in the world, both knew that their story was entering a new chapter. No longer tentative friendship or careful courtship, but committed love ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The homeless woman and the billionaire had become simply Solange and Theo, two people who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been missing their entire lives. Two people ready to prove that love really could bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle, transform any life brave enough to embrace it fully. The storm had passed, but their journey together was just beginning. Chapter 5. 3 weeks later, Solange signed the lease on her first apartment in 8 months. The small one-bedroom wasn't much, a few blocks from the community center, with windows that faced an alley rather than a view, but it was hers. As she turned the key in the lock for the first time, Theo beside her carrying the few belongings that represented her entire life, she felt something she'd forgotten existed: home. The weeks that followed the storm felt like living in a beautiful dream that might dissolve at any moment. Solange accepted Theo's job offer to coordinate the expanded literacy program, and suddenly her days transformed from survival-focused scrambling to purposeful work that fed her soul. She had an office in the community center, a salary that allowed her to rent a small but clean apartment, and the joy of watching children discover the magic of reading. But more than professional stability, she had Theo. Not just stolen lunch hours anymore, but real dates, long conversations that stretched into evening, quiet moments of connection that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. They were careful about public appearances, understanding instinctively that their relationship needed time to strengthen before facing the scrutiny it would inevitably attract. But in private, they discovered incompatibility that went far beyond physical attraction. They shared books and dreams, fears and hopes, the comfortable intimacy of two people learning to trust completely. Theo found himself reshaping his priorities around the woman who'd become his compass. Board meetings that once consumed his attention now felt like obligations to endure between moments with Solange. Corporate strategies that had once excited him paled beside the satisfaction of funding programs that transformed children's lives. He was still a successful businessman, but success had taken on new meaning. Impact rather than just income, connection rather than just conquest. For a brief, shining month, it seemed possible that love really could conquer the practical obstacles that stood between them. Solange thrived in her new role, bringing creativity and passion to educational programming that exceeded even Theo's optimistic expectations. Their personal relationship deepened daily, built on foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that felt unshakable. But fairy tales don't exist in boardrooms, and happily ever after doesn't automatically follow declarations of love. The first crack in their paradise came on a Tuesday morning when Victoria Sterling arrived at Theo's office with a manila folder and an expression that mixed sympathy with barely concealed satisfaction. "Theodore," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the confident authority of someone who'd never doubted her welcome, "we need to discuss your recent, charitable activities." Theo's hand paused over his coffee cup, every instinct suddenly alert. Victoria's tone carried the particular danger of someone who believed they held winning cards in a game the other player didn't realize they were playing. "The literacy program funding?" Theo asked carefully. It's been remarkably successful. Children's reading scores have improved dramatically, and the community response has been overwhelmingly positive. I'm sure it has, Victoria replied, opening her folder with deliberate precision. But the board has some concerns about the selection process for program coordinator. Specifically, the qualifications of the woman you hired. She slid several photographs across Theo's desk, surveillance images that made his blood run cold. Solange at the homeless shelter where she'd volunteered. Solange sleeping in her car. Solange emerging from the YMCA with shower supplies and the hollow look of someone trying to maintain dignity while everything crumbled around them. Solange Rivers, Victoria continued with clinical detachment, former elementary school teacher, terminated due to medical bankruptcies related to her mother's cancer treatment. Homeless for approximately 8 months before her sudden employment with our community literacy initiative. Theo's jaw clenched as he processed the violation represented by these images. Someone had been watching Solange, investigating her, reducing her complex humanity to a collection of incriminating photographs. Ms. Rivers is exceptionally qualified for her position, Theo said with ice-cold authority. Her educational background, her experience with children, her understanding of the community we serve. Her romantic relationship with you, Victoria interrupted smoothly. Which raises questions about the integrity of our hiring process, the appropriateness of using corporate funds for personal agendas, and your judgment regarding conflicts of interest. The words hung in the air like poison arrows, each one carefully aimed at Theo's most vulnerable points. Because Victoria was right about one thing, mixing business with personal relationships created complications that could be exploited by anyone looking for leverage. My personal life is not subject to board oversight, Theo replied, though he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. It is when it affects corporate decision-making, Victoria said. When it creates liability issues, public relations problems, potential legal exposure. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to protect shareholder interests, and romantic entanglements with employees represent exactly the kind of risk we're obligated to address. She leaned forward, her expression shifting to something that might have been concern if her eyes hadn't remained calculating. Theodore, I understand the appeal. She's attractive, there's probably something exciting about the Pygmalion fantasy of transforming a homeless woman into a suitable companion. But you're too intelligent to believe this can end anywhere but disaster. Careful, Victoria, Theo warned, his voice dropping to the tone that made adversaries reconsider their strategies. You're talking about a woman I care about deeply. A woman whose character and qualifications you're not fit to judge. I'm talking about a liability, Victoria replied without flinching. A woman who could destroy everything you've built if this relationship goes wrong. What happens when she decides she wants a larger settlement than just a job? What happens when the media discovers that Theodore Blackwood is playing house with a homeless woman? What happens when the board loses confidence in your judgment entirely? Each question struck like a physical blow because each contained enough truth to hurt. Theo had built his empire by calculating risks and managing outcomes, but love, real love, defied calculation. Love required faith, vulnerability, the willingness to bet everything on someone else's heart. The board is prepared to offer a solution, Victoria continued, sliding another document across his desk. Ms. Rivers's contract can be terminated with a generous severance package. She'll have enough money to start fresh somewhere else, and you can return your focus to the responsibilities that actually matter. Theo stared at the termination paperwork without touching it, feeling rage and protective fury war with the cold logic that had governed his business decisions for 20 years. Victoria was offering him an out, a way to preserve his empire while sacrificing his heart. And if I refuse, he asked quietly. Then the board will be forced to consider whether your personal compromises have made you unfit for leadership, Victoria replied with the patience of someone explaining inevitable consequences to a stubborn child. The Hartwell takeover bid is still active, Theodore. Our shareholders are nervous about leadership stability. This relationship provides exactly the kind of ammunition they need to justify a change in management. The threat was crystal clear: choose Solange or choose his company, but not both. Choose love or choose legacy. Choose the woman who'd awakened his humanity or the empire that had consumed it. I need time to consider this, Theo said finally, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos raging in his chest. Of course, Victoria replied, gathering her papers with the satisfaction of someone who'd delivered a decisive blow. But don't take too long. The board meets Thursday to discuss your situation. I'd hate for them to interpret delay as an inability to make difficult decisions. After Victoria left, Theo sat alone in his office staring at the photographs of Solange's lowest moments, feeling something toxic seep into the joy that had sustained him for weeks. Not doubt about his feelings, those remained as strong as ever, but fear about what loving her might cost them both. Was Victoria right? Was he being selfish, exposing Solange to scrutiny and judgment she didn't deserve? Was his love protective or possessive, healing or harmful? Love often asks us to choose between what's easy and what's real. Have you ever had to fight for a relationship that others didn't understand? Tell us about it in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else facing the same choice. Meanwhile, Solange was experiencing her own crisis 3 miles away in the community center where she'd found purpose again. Sarah Jones, the social worker who'd become a trusted friend, sat across from her desk with an expression that mixed concern with reluctant duty. I need to tell you something, Sarah said without preamble. There have been inquiries about you. Official ones. People asking questions about your background, your relationship with Theodore Blackwood, whether you're appropriate for your current position. Solange's stomach dropped like a stone. She'd known this was coming, known that their relationship was too visible, too unusual, too threatening to people invested in maintaining existing power structures. But knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. What kind of inquiries, she asked, though she dreaded the answer. The kind that come from people with money and influence who want to build cases, Sarah replied grimly. Background checks, financial investigations, interviews with people from your past. Someone's looking for dirt, Solange. Someone wants to destroy what you've built here. Because of Theo, Solange said quietly. It wasn't a question. Because of what you represent, Sarah corrected. You're proof that people can rise above circumstances, that love doesn't respect class boundaries, that worth isn't determined by wealth. That scares people who've built their identities on the idea that money equals value. Solange absorbed this, feeling the weight of becoming a symbol when all she'd wanted was to be a person. She thought about the children in her literacy program, the joy on their faces when they discovered new books, the pride in their parents' eyes when reading scores improved. Was she putting all of that at risk by loving a man whose world couldn't accept her presence in it? What do you think I should do? She asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. I think you should be prepared for things to get harder before they get easier. I think you should decide whether your love for Theodore is strong enough to weather the storm that's coming. And I think you should remember that running away now won't protect you, it will just give your enemies exactly what they want. That evening, Solange and Theo met at their apartment, the small, cozy space she'd rented with her first month's salary, where they'd shared quiet dinners and quiet dreams, where they'd begun building a life together despite the obstacles arrayed against them. But tonight felt different. They moved around each other with careful politeness, both carrying the weight of their separate crises, both afraid to voice the fears that threatened to destroy what they'd built. How was your day? Theo asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Complicated, Solange replied, settling onto the couch beside him but leaving more space than usual between them. Yours? Complicated, Theo echoed. They sat in silence for several minutes, both staring at their hands rather than each other's faces. Finally, Solange couldn't bear the careful distance anymore. Someone's been investigating me, she said quietly. Asking questions, digging into my past, looking for reasons why I shouldn't be with you. Victoria came to see me today, Theo replied. With photographs. Proof of your circumstances before we met. The board considers our relationship a liability. The words hung between them like a death sentence. All their careful hope, their growing love, their plans for a future together, suddenly it all felt fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the first real test. Maybe they're right, Solange said, the words cutting her throat like broken glass. Maybe I am a liability. Maybe loving me is going to cost you everything you've worked for. Don't, Theo said fiercely, turning to face her fully. Don't let them poison what we have with their fear and prejudice. But what if they're not wrong? Solange asked, tears threatening despite her attempts at composure. What if I really am putting everything at risk, your company, your reputation, the literacy program, all the good we could do together? What if loving me destroys everything you've built? Theo reached for her hands, holding them tightly despite the way she tried to pull away. Then we build something new. Together. Something better than what came before. That's easy to say when you're not the one being investigated like a criminal, Solange replied, her composure finally cracking. That's easy to say when you're not the one whose past is being turned into weapons against the person you love. You think this is easy for me? Theo asked, his own control fraying. You think I don't know what choosing you means? I could lose my company, my life's work, everything I've built over 20 years. But you know what terrifies me more than losing all of that? Losing you. Living the rest of my life knowing I was too much of a coward to fight for the one thing that actually matters. What if fighting isn't enough? Solange whispered. What if love isn't enough to overcome the differences between us? Then we'll find out together, Theo said with quiet determination. But I won't give up without a fight. I won't let fear make decisions for my heart. Before Solange could respond, both their phones buzzed with news alerts. They looked at their screens simultaneously, and Solange felt the color drain from her face. The headline on every major news site was the same: Blackwood Industries CEO involved with homeless employee, corporate romance or conflict of interest? The story was devastating in its clinical detail. Photos of Solange during her lowest moments. Financial records showing her medical bankruptcy. Employment records showing the gap between her teaching position and her current job. Timeline analysis suggesting her relationship with Theo had directly influenced her hiring. And quotes, anonymous board members expressing concern about leadership judgment, questions about corporate governance, concerns about public perception and shareholder confidence. Oh God, Solange breathed, scrolling through article after article, each one more damaging than the last. Oh God, Theo, what have we done? But the worst part wasn't the invasion of privacy or the corporate intrigue. The worst part was the comments section below each article, hundreds of people expressing opinions about their relationship, their worthiness, their motives. Strangers who'd never met them reducing their love to tabloid entertainment, their private moments to public scandal. This is what I was afraid of, Solange said, her voice hollow with shock. This is exactly what I was afraid of. This is war, Theo replied grimly, his jaw set with determination. They leaked this to pressure us, to make us break apart before the board meeting. They're trying to force my hand. Maybe we should let them, Solange said quietly. Maybe this is the universe telling us that some things are too impossible to overcome. No, Theo said fiercely, pulling her closer despite her resistance. This is people without souls trying to destroy something beautiful because they can't understand it. This is fear and prejudice in corporate politics, but it's not truth. It's not us. But even as he held her, even as he spoke words of defiance and determination, both could feel something precious slipping away. The private sanctuary of their love had been violated, exposed to harsh lights and harsher judgment. The careful world they'd built together was under siege from forces that seemed impossible to defeat. That night, they lay in bed holding each other with desperate intensity, both afraid to sleep, afraid to let go, afraid that morning might bring news that would force them apart forever. Outside, the city hummed with its normal rhythms, traffic and sirens and the sounds of 8 million people living their lives, but inside their small apartment, everything felt suspended on the edge of catastrophe. Whatever happens, Theo whispered into Solange's hair, I want you to know that loving you has been the most real thing I've ever experienced. You saved me, Solange. You brought me back to life. You saved me too, she whispered back, pressing closer to his warmth. You showed me that I was worthy of love, that my circumstances didn't define my value. Whatever happens, I'll never regret that. But despite their declarations of commitment, both lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if love really was enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them. Wondering if sometimes the kindest thing love could do was step aside rather than fight a battle that might destroy everything it touched. The morning would bring new challenges, new pressures, new tests of their commitment to each other. The board meeting would force decisions that couldn't be postponed. The media attention would intensify rather than fade. Soon, very soon, they would have to choose between the safe path and the true path, between preserving what they had separately and building something new together. Soon they would discover whether a homeless woman and a billionaire could create a love strong enough to withstand the full force of a world determined to keep them apart. The crisis had arrived, just as they'd always known it would. The question now was whether their love was strong enough to survive it, or whether the very act of fighting for it would destroy everything they'd hoped to protect. Chapter 6. The morning of the board meeting arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather itself was mocking the storm brewing in the gleaming towers of downtown corporate power. Theo dressed with mechanical precision, his most expensive suit, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, cufflinks that had belonged to his father. Armor for a battle that would determine not just his professional future, but the fate of his heart. Solange woke alone in their apartment, Theo having left early to prepare for what they both knew would be the defining moment of their relationship. She'd offered to attend the meeting, to face the board's questions directly, but Theo had refused. "This isn't about you," he'd said. "This is about them trying to control me through fear. I won't give them that power." But as Solange sat in her empty kitchen, staring at cold coffee and unanswered text messages from reporters seeking comment, she wondered if absence would be interpreted as cowardice. If by staying away, she was somehow validating their narrative that she was inappropriate, unsuitable, unworthy of standing beside Theodore Blackwood in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The community center felt different that morning, charged with intention that had nothing to do with the children's excited chatter about their upcoming reading performances. Staff members avoided her eyes, conversation died when she entered rooms, and Solange realized with sick certainty that the poison of public scandal was already seeping into the place that had become her sanctuary. "Miss Solange?" 7-year-old Marcus tugged at her sleeve, his face scrunched with the particular concern children show when their stable world suddenly feels uncertain. "Are you okay? My mama said people on TV are saying mean things about you." Solange knelt to Marcus's eye level, her heart breaking at the worry in his young face. This was exactly what she'd feared, that her personal crisis would contaminate the pure space of children's learning, that her presence would become a distraction from the real work of education. "Sometimes adults disagree about things," she said carefully. "But that doesn't change how proud I am of your reading progress, or how excited I am to hear you perform your poem today." "Are you going away?" Marcus asked with the directness children bring to important questions. The question hit Solange like a physical blow because she didn't know the answer. Was she going away? Would today's board meeting force decisions that would end not just her relationship with Theo, but her ability to do the work she loved with the children who needed her? "I hope not," she said honestly. "I love working here with all of you. But sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices." "I hope you stay," Marcus said, throwing his arms around her neck with fierce 7-year-old conviction. "You're the best teacher ever." As Solange held Marcus, feeling his complete trust and uncomplicated affection, she realized something crucial: running away wouldn't protect these children or this program. Running away would just teach them that love wasn't worth fighting for, that pressure from powerful people should override personal conviction, that circumstances mattered more than character. Meanwhile, 20 floors above the City and Blackwood Industries boardroom, Theo faced a tribunal of expensive suits and hostile expressions. The mahogany table that had witnessed countless deals and strategic victories now felt like a court where his character would be tried and potentially found wanting. Victoria Sterling presided with barely concealed satisfaction, her presentation materials arranged with military precision. Richard Hayes wore the expression of someone finally seeing years of patience and plotting about to bear fruit. The other board members, men and women who'd made fortunes by calculating risk and eliminating uncertainty, studied Theo like accountants reviewing a failing investment. "Theodore," Victoria began with false sympathy, "we've asked you here today because your recent, personal choices have created unprecedented liability for this company. As fiduciaries, we have an obligation to address situations that threaten shareholder value and corporate stability." She activated the presentation screen, and Solange's face appeared a professional headshot from her teaching days, but somehow made to look threatening in this context of corporate analysis. Solange Rivers, Victoria continued. Hired as literacy program coordinator despite a problematic employment gap, financial instability, and no permanent address at the time of hiring. Her selection for this position coincided precisely with the beginning of your romantic relationship, creating obvious questions about the integrity of our hiring process. Each word was a calculated attack, designed to reduce Solange's humanity to a series of risk factors and liability concerns. Theo felt rage building in his chest, not just at the distortion of facts, but at the casual cruelty of turning someone's lowest moments into weapons against their worth. Ms. Rivers is exceptionally qualified for her position, Theo replied with ice-cold precision. She holds advanced degrees in education, has 5 years of classroom experience, and has demonstrated unprecedented success in our literacy program. Children's reading scores have improved by 40% under her leadership. Impressive statistics, Richard Hayes interjected with calculated dismissal. But irrelevant to the central question. Did you hire your girlfriend to justify continuing a relationship that serves no corporate interest? I hired the most qualified candidate available, Theo replied. Her personal circumstances at the time of hiring have no bearing on her professional competence. Her personal circumstances, Victoria said with surgical precision, include medical bankruptcy, homelessness, and dependence on charitable organizations for basic survival. These are not character flaws, but they do represent potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited against this company. She clicked to the next slide, financial projections showing potential costs of sexual harassment lawsuits, wrongful termination claims, public relations disasters. Everything calculated to make love look like a liability, connection like a weakness to be excised. The solution is simple, Victoria continued. Ms. Rivers's contract includes a termination clause that can be activated for any reason. We offer her a generous severance package enough to ensure her comfortable transition to other opportunities, and you refocus on the responsibilities that actually matter. And if I refuse? Theo asked, though he already knew the answer. Then we'll be forced to consider whether your judgment has been so compromised by personal entanglements that you're no longer capable of effective leadership, Richard replied with the satisfaction of someone finally deploying a long-held weapon. The Hartwell takeover offer remains active. If the board loses confidence in current management, the threat hung in the air like poison gas. Choose the woman or choose the company, but not both. Choose love or choose legacy. Choose the heart that had finally learned to feel or the empire that had demanded its silence. But as Theo sat in that sterile boardroom, surrounded by people who confused wealth with worth, success with significance, he remembered a park bench where a homeless woman had offered half her sandwich to a stranger. He remembered rain-soaked pavilions in community centers filled with children learning to read. He remembered what it felt like to be seen, really seen, by someone who valued character over assets. You're asking me to choose between my company and my conscience, Theo said quietly. Between preserving an empire and protecting someone I love. Between keeping power and keeping faith with the man I become because of her influence. We're asking you to choose wisely, Victoria replied. To consider what you'll lose if you prioritize romantic fantasy over business reality. What I'll lose, Theo repeated, standing slowly, is my soul. Again. What I'll lose is the first genuine happiness I've felt in 20 years. What I'll lose is the woman who taught me that success without significance is just expensive emptiness. He looked around the table at faces that reflected calculation without compassion, strategy without soul, and realized that somewhere along the way, he'd confused winning with living. I choose her, Theo said with quiet certainty. I choose love over logic, connection over conquest, authentic relationship over artificial empire. I choose the woman who sees my heart over the board that only sees my holdings. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face cycled through surprise, disappointment, and finally cold calculation as she realized her carefully laid trap had backfired. Theodore, she said with the patience of someone explaining consequences to a child, you're making a mistake that will cost you everything. No, Theo replied, already reaching for his briefcase, already planning his next moves. I'm finally making a choice that will give me everything that actually matters. As he walked toward the boardroom door, Richard Hayes called after him with vicious satisfaction. You have 48 hours to change your mind before we call an emergency vote on leadership. After that, you'll lose the company anyway, and you'll have nothing to show for this romantic delusion but poverty and regret. I'll have love, Theo replied without turning around. I'll have authenticity, purpose, and the woman who awakened all of it. That's more wealth than you'll ever understand. The door closed behind him with finality that felt like liberation. An hour later, Theo burst into the community center with the wild energy of a man who just bet everything on a single hand and felt certain he was going to win. Children scattered like startled birds as he strode through the hallways calling Solange's name, his expensive suit completely out of place among construction paper art projects and miniature reading nooks. He found her in her office, surrounded by lesson plans and children's drawings, looking like everything beautiful and worthwhile he'd ever wanted to protect. When she looked up and saw his face radiant with decision, alive with purpose, she knew without words what he'd chosen. You quit, she said, not accusingly but with wonder at his courage. I chose you, Theo replied, crossing the small office in 3 strides and pulling her into his arms. I chose us. I chose the literacy program and the children's laughter and the morning coffee we share and the way you make me remember what it feels like to be human. Theo, Solange breathed against his chest, you don't understand what you've given up. I know exactly what I'm giving up, he said, his voice breaking slightly. 20 years of building nothing that mattered. 20 years of accumulating wealth without gathering wisdom, power without purpose, success without significance. He kissed her then, right there in her tiny office with children's artwork covering the walls, and it tasted like freedom, like choice, like 2 people finally brave enough to build something real together. They'll destroy us, Solange whispered when they broke apart. The media, the board, everyone who has an investment in keeping people like us separate. Let them try, Theo said with quiet conviction. We'll build something they can't tear down. Something based on love instead of fear, connection instead of conquest, contribution instead of just accumulation. What will we do? Solange asked. How will we survive without your company, your resources? We'll figure it out together, Theo replied. We'll use what I have left to expand the literacy program, maybe start our own foundation. We'll find ways to make a difference that don't require board approval or shareholder votes. We'll build a life that serves love instead of demanding its sacrifice. As he spoke, Solange felt something settle in her chest, not just love for this impossible, beautiful man, but faith in their future together. Faith that sometimes the bravest thing love could do was fight back instead of giving in. Faith that 2 people committed to building something meaningful could overcome any obstacle corporate power could create. That evening, as news broke that Theodore Blackwood had resigned from his own company to protect his relationship with a former homeless woman, the world exploded with opinions and analysis and commentary. Stock prices fluctuated. Rival companies positioned themselves to absorb Blackwood Industries' market share. Business schools would study Theo's decision for years as either the ultimate example of poor judgment or the ultimate example of authentic leadership. But in a small apartment across town, Solange and Theo sat together on their couch, hands intertwined, planning a future that would prioritize love over profit, purpose over prestige, authentic connection over artificial success. They would face challenges, financial uncertainty, social judgment, the complex work of building a life that honored both their values and their commitment to each other. But they would face them together, hearts aligned, committed to proving that sometimes the most impossible love stories are actually the most necessary ones. Outside their window, the city glittered with the dreams and ambitions of 8 million people, but inside their small sanctuary, 2 hearts beat with the quiet certainty that they had chosen correctly. They had chosen each other, chosen love, chosen the beautiful risk of building something real in a world that often settled for artificial substitutes. The homeless woman and the billionaire had become simply Solange and Theo. 2 people brave enough to believe that love, real love, was worth any sacrifice, any risk, any consequence. And as they held each other in the darkness of their apartment, both knew that their story was just beginning. The most beautiful chapters were yet to be written, and they would write them together, one day of authentic living at a time. Chapter 7. 6 months later, the autumn leaves were falling again in Riverside Park, painting the world in the same golden hues that had witnessed the beginning of an impossible love story. But everything else had changed in ways that would have seemed like fantasy when a homeless woman first offered half her sandwich to a defeated stranger. The park bench where it all began now bore a small brass plaque, in honor of unexpected kindness and the courage to choose love over logic. Theo had commissioned it as an anniversary gift, though he'd refused to tell Solange what anniversary they were celebrating, their first meeting, their first kiss, or the day he'd chosen her over his empire. All of them, he'd said with the smile that still made her heart skip. Every day we choose each other is an anniversary worth marking. The Blackwood Rivers Foundation occupied a converted warehouse in the Arts District, its open-plan offices buzzing with the energy of people who discovered that meaningful work felt completely different from profitable work. Where Blackwood Industries had been all marble and mahogany, all efficiency and hierarchy, the foundation felt alive, walls covered with children's artwork, break rooms that doubled as reading nooks, meeting spaces designed for collaboration rather than competition. Solange's office overlooked the foundation's crown jewel, a state-of-the-art literacy center where children from across the city came to discover that books could be friends, that learning could be joy, that someone believed in their potential enough to invest in their futures. Through her window, she could see Theo reading with a group of 7-year-olds, his expensive suit jacket traded for a foundation t-shirt, his executive demeanor softened into something that looked remarkably like happiness. The transformation had been neither instant nor easy. Theo's departure from Blackwood Industries had triggered exactly the corporate chaos Victoria Sterling had predicted. Stock prices plummeted, the Hartwell takeover succeeded, and hundreds of employees faced uncertain futures as the company was dismantled and absorbed into its competitors' operations. But it had also triggered something Victoria hadn't anticipated, a flood of support from people who believed that sometimes love really was worth more than money, that sometimes the most important battles were fought with hearts instead of lawyers, that sometimes choosing humanity over profit was exactly the kind of leadership the world needed more of. Donations poured in from unexpected sources. Former Blackwood Industries employees who'd been inspired by their CEO's courage, business leaders who'd been quietly hoping someone would prove that success could be redefined, ordinary families who saw their own struggles reflected in Solange's journey from homelessness to purpose. The foundation's literacy programs now serve 12 schools across the city. Their adult education initiative helped parents earn GEDs while their children attended reading groups. Their teacher training workshops spread Solange's innovative methods to classrooms throughout the region. What had begun as a small community center program had grown into a movement that was transforming how entire neighborhoods thought about education and opportunity. But the most profound transformation was visible every morning when Theo and Solange arrived at work together, not CEO and employee, not billionaire and charity case, but partners in every sense of the word. Partners in love, in purpose, in the daily work of building something meaningful from the ashes of what they'd left behind. The literacy center numbers are incredible, Solange said, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed reading improvement rates exceeding their most optimistic projections. We're changing lives, Theo. Real lives, real futures. We're proving that love multiplies, Theo replied, settling beside her desk with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable intimacy of people who'd learned to work and dream together. Every child who discovers they're smart, every parent who learns to read alongside their kids, every teacher who finds new ways to reach struggling students, it all started with kindness shared on a park bench. It started with you seeing past circumstances to character, Solange corrected. It started with you believing that someone like me could be worthy of someone like you. Someone like you, Theo said with the exasperated affection of someone who'd been having this argument for months, taught someone like me what being worthy actually means. It's not about bank accounts or social status or what other people think you deserve. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching. It's about choosing kindness when kindness costs you something. Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices in the hallway, children from the afternoon reading program, bubbling with the particular joy that came from mastering new skills. Marcus, now 8 years old and reading at grade level, burst into Solange's office with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. Miss Solange. Mr. Theo, he called, clutching a book to his chest like treasure. I finished the whole Harry Potter book. The whole thing. And I understood everything. That's incredible, Marcus, Solange said, rising to give him the hug his achievement deserved. I'm so proud of how hard you've worked. Are you proud too, Mr. Theo? Marcus asked with the directness children brought to important questions. I'm more proud than words can express, Theo replied seriously. You've proven that when someone believes in you and you believe in yourself, there's nothing you can't accomplish. Just like you and Miss Solange, Marcus said with matter-of-fact wisdom. Mrs. Chin told us that some people said you couldn't be together because you were different kinds of people. But you proved them wrong because you loved each other enough to fight for it. Out of the mouths of babes. Theo and Solange exchanged a look that contained volumes of shared memory, rain-soaked pavilions and hostile boardrooms, impossible choices and beautiful consequences, the daily work of proving that love really could overcome any obstacle that dared to stand in its way. That's exactly right, Solange said softly. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is fight for what you know is right, even when other people don't understand it. Especially then, Theo added, his hand finding Solange's with the automatic comfort of people who'd learned to face everything together. That evening, as they walked home through the same park where everything had begun, Theo and Solange found themselves gravitating toward their original bench as if drawn by invisible threads of memory and gratitude. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't offered you that sandwich? Solange asked, settling beside him in the spot where a homeless woman and a billionaire had first discovered they were simply two lonely people in need of connection. Every day, Theo replied honestly. I think about how close I came to missing the most important moment of my life. How I almost walked right past the woman who would teach me what it means to be fully alive. You wouldn't have walked past, Solange said with quiet certainty. You would have seen something, maybe not immediately, but eventually. Your heart was already awakening, Theo. I just happened to be there when it was ready to open. No, Theo said, turning to face her fully in the fading autumn light. You didn't just happen to be there. You chose to be there. You chose kindness when you had every reason to protect what little you had. You chose generosity when generosity was a luxury you couldn't afford. You chose to see another person's need as more important than your own hunger. He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a ring that caught the last rays of sunlight like captured starfire. You chose love before you even knew what you were choosing, Theo continued, his voice rough with emotion. And I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you back. Every day, every moment, every breath. I want to choose this impossible, beautiful love we've built together. Solange stared at the ring, not ostentatious but perfect, not designed to impress but to symbolize, and felt her heart expand with so much joy it seemed her chest might not be able to contain it. Theo, she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. Marry me, Solange, he said with the same quiet conviction he'd brought to every important decision since the day he'd chosen her over his empire. Marry me and let's prove that love stories don't end with happily ever after, they begin with it. Let's spend our lives building something beautiful together, something that serves love instead of demanding its sacrifice. Yes, Solange said through tears that felt like blessing, like rain on parched earth, like the answer to every prayer she'd never dared to voice. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. As Theo slipped the ring onto her finger, both marveled at how perfectly it fit, not just the ring, but everything. Their hands, their hearts, their dreams for a future that would honor both the love they'd found and the purpose they'd discovered together. Around them, the park settled into evening quiet, but their bench seemed to hum with the energy of beginning rather than ending. Somewhere in the distance, children played and parents watched, and life continued its eternal rhythms of hope and loss and connection. But on their bench, where a homeless woman had once shared her last sandwich with a broken billionaire, two hearts beat with the quiet certainty that sometimes the most impossible love stories become the most necessary ones. Sometimes the greatest wealth is found in giving everything away for the sake of authentic connection. Sometimes the most important empires are built not from profit and power, but from kindness and courage and the revolutionary belief that every person deserves to be seen, valued, and loved exactly as they are. The homeless woman and the billionaire had become simply Solange and Theo, two people who'd learned that true richness had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the courage to choose love over fear, connection over conquest, authentic relationship over artificial success. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, they knew their story was just beginning. The most beautiful chapters were yet to be written, and they would write them together, one day of authentic living at a time, one choice to choose love at a time, one moment of proving that kindness really could change the world at a time. Sometimes the richest person in the room really is the one willing to share their last sandwich. Sometimes love really does conquer all. Not through magic or wishful thinking, but through the daily work of choosing each other, choosing kindness, choosing to build something beautiful in a world that often settles for functional instead of meaningful. And sometimes, just sometimes, a simple act of generosity on a park bench becomes the first sentence in a love story that transforms not just two hearts, but everyone those hearts touch in their journey toward happiness, purpose, and the revolutionary discovery that being truly wealthy means having someone to share your riches with, no matter what form those riches take. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of authentic love, and tell me, what should tomorrow's Dear Love Diaries story explore? Your suggestions help shape our community's journey.